Hi, everybody. It's Britt Hartley with No Nonsense Spirituality, and today we're going to be doing enlightenment. So, what is enlightenment, especially from a secular point of view? Pitfalls, common pitfalls on the path of enlightenment, and how enlightenment or awakening journeys can be different for men and women based on how we're socialized. And I just want to say at the very beginning, this isn't one of those things where like I'm claiming to be enlightened and I'm going to teach all of you down here how to follow in my footsteps. I'm not that kind of teacher. It's more so that I've been studying in the spiritual space, in religion and philosophy. I've been studying gurus and talking to people about their spiritual journeys for a long time. And I just want to share things that I've learned along the way. Many of the pitfalls that I'll even be talking about are things that either I fell into or I would have a teacher kind of calling out my own blind spot. So this is in no way saying I am enlightened, follow me. This is just saying I've been reading and studying and on my own journey, and here are some things that may be helpful for you wherever you are in your journey. So we're going to take it from that stance here. I'm not a guru. All right. So from an atheistic or naturalistic standpoint, enlightenment isn't this like cosmic magical download or divine reward. It's really a neurocognitive shift. It's a profound change in how the brain perceives reality and self and meaning, because our brains evolved for survival, not truth, and certainly not happiness. And so our brains are full of biases that helped our ancestors avoid predators and secure resources and bond into tribes. And there's a lot of downsides to those biases that make us suffer more. So one would be like the negativity bias. The brain pays more attention to threats than neutral or positive things. And I still have that. Like if I read 100 positive comments, I'll still remember the one scathing comment more than I'll remember the 100 positive things. It's just something our brains do fairly naturally. There's a self-centered bias where we're constantly scanning, what does this mean for me, because of self-preservation. There's pattern-seeking biases where the brain's trying to find meaning and causality even when it's random, which we have because it was safer to assume that it was a tiger in the bushes than assuming it was nothing. We have tribal biases. So we have a strong in-group, out-group thinking because sticking with our tribe increased our survival chances. And there's lots of these biases and patterns going on in our brain. And so when people talk about enlightenment from a brain point of view, they're talking about slowly overcoming or rewiring these survival biases so that we're no longer overreacting to every potential threat. We're not clinging so tightly to our image or a sense of self as the center of the universe. And we're more likely to be able to perceive things as they are rather than through the lens of fear or judgment or control, which means that we can sit with uncertainty without compulsively forcing either meaning or clinging to something when there's no need to do that. And eventually that helps us to become happier, and not in a delusional way, happier while also seeing and being able to face reality as it is. And so I wouldn't call enlightenment something that you arrive at. I would say that the first time that you just have a thought where instead of just reacting with anger, you just notice I am angry and you just get curious about it, and maybe you make an intentional choice to not act in anger. The first time you do that, which could have been like when you're 8 years old and a sibling bothers you and you just decide not to punch him in the face, I would say the first time that you do that, where you don't just react and you just notice that instead of saying I am angry, you're saying I notice that I'm angry. The first time that you do that, you're on an enlightenment journey. You're on an awakening journey. And we're just always improving our ability to sit with and see things as they really are, and also reduce our brain's potential for suffering because of how self-obsessed and neurotic it is. So how this happens mechanistically, research into long-term meditators, which is fascinating to read the studies on long-term meditators, or people who do psychedelics, people who do trauma integration, neuroplasticity studies, suggest that this kind of mindfulness, this self-inquiry, will actually process real brain structures, change real brain structures over time. So The default mode network is the brain's kind of like self-story generator. It decreases during deep meditation, and this leads to reduced kind of ego chatter and self-obsession where we just suffer so much. This turns off during psychedelics, which is why psychedelics are so helpful for anytime you're trapped in a thought pattern. That's why it's helpful for OCD and PTSD and depression, because all of those things are us getting stuck in our thoughts, essentially our thought patterns. For amygdala reactivity, which is our fear center, that's going to shrink with mindfulness or enlightenment kind of practices, and that's going to reduce that threat overreaction that we have. Our prefrontal cortex gains stronger regulation over emotional outbursts, so we become more intentional rather than reactive. And then the insular cortex, which is the awareness of our body and our emotional states, become more active, which leads to just a more embodied perception of what's going on rather than just like getting stuck in your thought patterns and ruminating. So in short, the enlightened brain just stops compulsively defending this fragile self, stops fighting reality, stops filtering everything through constant fear and craving, and you start to experience more life like sensations are just sensations, not problems. Thoughts are just thoughts, not commandments. Emotions are waves, not verdicts. You are part of reality, not separate from it. And we don't need supernatural beliefs for any of that. It's really just an evolutionary hack using the brain's ability to adapt to neuroplasticity to liberate itself from its own outdated survival software that makes us suffer because it was meant for a world that we no longer inhabit. I'm really not going to be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. So like, why is my brain freaking out like it is? And that means that your brain is able to be freer from illusion and just a better place to live in. That's what we're trying to do here. Like, I'm not trying to release my soul into the 16th dimension or going to 5D frequencies or whatever the new age people are saying. It's really just, I live in my brain. My brain was created with a lot of biases for a world that I no longer believe in, and that makes me suffer a lot more than I need to. And because I live in my brain, I'm going to make my brain a better place to live in. That's what an awakening and enlightenment journey is for me. It's the clear, deep realization that you're not separate from life. It's dropping the illusions, especially the illusions about yourself, seeing things as they are without needing fairy tales to make it comfortable. So it's not about becoming special or ascending to some magical plane. It's more of this sense of waking up for a dream where you thought you were the center of everything. You're just reacting and realizing that you're part of this vast, interconnected, chaotic, beautiful reality that doesn't owe you anything, and that's okay. It's emotional maturity at an existential level that we can even see in how your brain changes when you are on a path that encourages this kind of awakening. So I don't think it's a place that, where we arrive at, where I'm enlightened and you are not. It's a journey that starts the first time you're able to just not react. So a simple version of this would be, the first step that you often see is, I'm not who I thought I was, and the world is not what I thought it was. And that's not a crisis, that's an invitation. Okay, there's some aspect of that tends to be a first step. And that to me is what the beginning of an awakening journey is. It's waking up from the dream, from your conditioned thoughts, from the illusion that you're in the center of the universe, and getting a little more of that space in between input and response. So here are the common pitfalls in a kind of awakening path where you feel like you're waking up from the dream of your own conditioning. And so these are the common things that at the beginning, especially, you're going to fall into when you kind of just started your awakening journey of waking up from the dream of what you are. So the first one that I see is a new identity trap. So I'm a spiritual person now. So it's ditching your old identity, a lawyer, mom, whatever, and replacing it with a new shiny, I'm enlightened, I'm spiritual persona. I have a man bun. I am enlightened now. And what this is you're still clinging. But it's a fancier or holier story. And so what happens sometimes if you haven't done the work of fully forming an ego is that spirituality then becomes your ego. And when that happens, it's very hard to work with because your ego can hide in spirituality and spiritual work because we're wrapping it all in this pretty language and talking about doing the work, but it's really just the ego wanting people to see that you're doing the work. And then you get caught in the ego identity trap of looking like a spiritual person. So what this looks like is someone does psychedelics once or goes to a retreat once, and they jump straight into teaching others, quoting Rumi, they're wearing beads, they're starting podcasts, and their ego is still running the show because they're not in tune with self-understanding enough, and they don't have teachers calling out their blind spots enough to know that their ego really didn't die down. It just moved, and it's still running the show, just it's doing so in spiritual clothing. I don't like to dog on individual people because I want to stay in the world of ideas, and I'm not the kind of person that just wants to like berate individual people. But like a good example of this as an idea, even though I don't know anything about her as a person, is like Shannon Blake. I don't know if you've seen her. I'll put a picture up here, but it's where the image of spirituality becomes your ego. And so she has a song. I don't think I can play it on YouTube where it will take it, but it says, I have big heart, big tits, big checks, and it's talking about how much money she's making in the world of spirituality. And it's like, it just, to me, it feels like, and not in a judgmental way, it just feels like, oh, she's young. This is what happens when you don't have a fully formed ego, and then your ego starts becoming the spiritual person. And then, she runs retreats, she makes a lot of money, she makes music and things like that, but it still feels like her ego is being dressed in spiritual clothing so that she can sell whatever she's trying to sell, so that her ego is getting whatever it needs. And that's okay. I just think we should recognize that for what it is, and realize that maybe that's not what a spiritual or awakening practice looks like at the end of your life, in the later stages of human development. And we could just appreciate it for what it is. I don't know how to say that and use an example without it sounding mean, but I, for one, am just not resonating with the spiritual message of big heart, big tits, big checks. That's not personally filling my cup, but I wish her well on her spiritual journey. The next pitfall that I see is using enlightenment as an escape. And I see this all the time where people start saying, ever since, I called this out on social media a while ago, ever since I became enlightened, I can't handle regular people. I can't relate to humanity anymore because I'm up here on this plane and they're down here. I hear this one all the time. And so, and I've definitely, I think, had times where I've felt like this. And so this is one of the most common pitfalls in an awakening journey. It's using awakening as a way to escape life rather than engage with it more deeply. Many people unconsciously imagine that enlightenment will put them above pain and conflict and responsibility and emotional complexity, that it's offering an exit from discomfort. But real awakening doesn't erase fear or grief or relational messiness. It changes your relationship to it. So when people start detaching from their emotions and their responsibilities and trying to avoid conflict and fantasizing about running away to monasteries or exploring the 12th dimension or constantly chasing the next drug breakthrough combination as a fix for dissatisfaction, what's really happening there, they're not waking up, they're not getting deeper into their life, they're avoiding. So real enlightenment isn't about leaving your life behind. And I have seen some gurus say, the next step for your spiritual practice is for you to leave your family. And like, as a mother, like, I deeply reject that idea. I deeply reject using spirituality to escape in that way. So it's about standing fully inside with open eyes with your relationships. It's deepening your tenderness. It's deepening your accountability. It's widening your capacity to stay connected to reality, even when it's uncomfortable. So if your awakening is making you less engaged, less responsible, less human, running away from relationships, you're not getting closer to the truth. You're running away from it and using spirituality as your train out of the messiness of the human experience. So my rule is, if your enlightenment awakening journey isn't making it easier to sit with your family of origin, then it's an escape. This also, now that doesn't mean that you're not allowed to have boundaries. I think that boundaries can be very healthy, but I do think you should be able to understand your own triggers and understand other people the more you're on your journey. Otherwise, what good is it for? Like, if it doesn't help you sit with your family, that's why they say, what's the quote that says, if you think you're awakened, or you think you're enlightened, go spend a week with your family. That's where the real work is. That's where the hardest love work is. And so if it isn't giving you tools for that, I would say it tends to be more of an escape. And this also includes a phenomenon called psychedelics chasing. So, another common trap is mistaking psychedelic experiences for permanent awakening. So, some people fall into this endlessly chasing the next trip, the next chemical combination, believing that just like with one more ceremony, one more dose, they'll finally arrive. And psychedelics can offer profound glimpses into realities like rawness, and just being able to sit, like turn off your default mode network and just kind of sit in beingness. But they're not a substitute for integration or emotional maturity or day to day engagement with life. So, in chasing peak experiences often becomes its own form of addiction. I've met with now many clients who are on that hamster wheel where there's this hunger for transcendence without the hard work of embodiment. And so, true awakening isn't about stacking visions or downloading cosmic insights. It's about how you live after the visions fade. So, if your spirituality needs to be chemically reignited every month in order to stay on that path, you're not awakening. You're just looping through escapism dressed as expansion. So I've met quite a people in coaching who are on this hamster wheel of psychedelics chasing. It gets to the point where their drug life is over here and their regular life is over here, and they're getting further and further apart without integrating, and that becomes really disorienting, and it doesn't lead to the kind of wholeness that we're looking for, which is why I usually recommend guides who can help you with reintegration therapy or helping you use psychedelics to open doors in the mind that you then learn how to walk into with your sober mind. So the studies that we have on psychedelics show that while psychedelics can reduce your default mode network activity and give you this, ego dissolution experiences, they do not, and we have the studies to show this, they do not guarantee integration or emotional maturity if you're not doing the sustained inner work and the therapy and the reintegration in between your trips. And so repeated psychedelic experiences without integration can turn into what researchers called spiritual materialism, which is using these profound experiences to again boost your ego, because your ego can hide in all of this so easily. So number 3 on my list of potential pitfalls is using spirituality to avoid your feelings. So in 1984, it was John Wellwood who coined the term spiritual bypassing. And it was because in his psychotherapy work, he noticed that many seekers were using spiritual ideas to suppress or deny or bypass unresolved emotional wounds. So spiritual bypassing happens when we use spiritual beliefs to avoid uncomfortable psychological realities. So instead of dealing with grief or anger or trauma or conflict, people might hide behind phrases like everything happens for a reason or just let it go, invalidating the real emotional work that needs to happen. So my unpopular take is I think that Yoda is doing spiritual bypassing when someone dies and he says, mourn them do not, miss them do not. They're one with the Force now. To me, that is Jedi spiritual bypassing, to say mourn them do not. That's spiritual bypassing. That's avoiding that it's sad that his mentor died. So when someone loses a loved one and immediately goes to, well, the soul never dies, everything's an illusion, whatever spiritual wrapping they want to put around that, they're not actually grieving. And they may actually develop physical symptoms later because they never process their real emotions. So true spirituality would allow for mourning, but also keep a larger container for that kind of mourning. So bypassing painful emotions in the name of spirituality doesn't lead to freedom. It leads to internal fragmentation, and true maturity integrates grief and rage and longing into the spiritual path rather than evading them. Another trap, and this would include me, absolutely, is premature certainty. So in traditional Buddhist maps, like the 10 ox herding pictures of Zen, early enlightenment experiences are followed by periods of disillusionment. And so the seventh and eighth ox herding pictures are literally about losing the sense of specialness and returning to the world with humility. So at what this looked like for me before I go into this, just to use a practical example, is there was a time where I felt like, because I left the Mormon church and because I was a truth seeker and I deconstructed, I'm better than Mormons. Like, I don't know if I would have said that, but certainly subconsciously would I have believed that about myself? The answer is yes. Especially earlier on when I had just left Mormonism, I felt like I had more moral courage than Mormons, and I felt like I was smarter, and I felt like I was more intelligent, and I felt like had more moral courage. And I really looked down on people who stayed in the church. And what happened after a while, though, as you continue on your path and as I become more humble, and also as I learn more about human nature, I realized that I didn't choose my core values. And so I didn't choose that truth seeking is a higher core value for me than, for example, loyalty. My brother, he's very high in loyalty, still active in the church. And also there are some people who can handle chaos more than others, and some who psychologically really struggle and suffer with too much uncertainty and ambiguity. And so me leaving Mormonism, like me reading the same thing as someone else, but my core values took me out of their church, and their core values that they didn't choose either kept them in the church. There's nothing about that makes me any better inherently. It really doesn't, because I didn't choose the core values that led me out of the church, and they didn't choose the core values or psychological states that keep them in the church. And so over time, I had that sense of feeling that separation, even feeling sometimes that I was better than people. And then all of that breaking down later on in my journey, where I realized that we're all just trees growing in our soil, and how a tree grows in its soil. We never look at a tree and say like, oh, that's a bad tree. It's like, no, that tree didn't get enough water. That tree had a lot of wind and it blew it, so it leans that way. And you just appreciate trees for what they are. And that came later on in my journey. So I'm trying to be honest here and be vulnerable where I can. So at certain stages, after big breakthroughs, it can feel like you've figured it all out. You're living in the now. You have shattered the illusion of reality. You're living non-dualism. You are exploring spiritual dimensions. You're talking to aliens. You're talking to gods. Whatever the idea is, I've literally heard them all at this point. But deep spirituality reveals that no map captures the whole territory. Clinging to one final answer stops your growth. Feeling like you're better than people certainly stops your growth. And it's an illusion of the ego anyway. Because if we don't have free will, then what are we really judging people on anyway? So real wisdom stays open. It knows that truth is layered and paradoxical and evolving, and that human development and human nature evolves, and there's strengths and weaknesses for each stage of human development. You will die not knowing more than you know, myself included. You and me will die as aware of the complexities of the universe as an ant understands quantum physics. The teachers I really look for at this stage in my journey are ones who have made peace with uncertainty, not the ones selling me their spiritual surety. If someone is sure of whatever spiritual ism that they're operating under, instantly for me, that's like a red flag. So an example would be, someone becomes obsessed with non-dual philosophy and insists, nothing matters, there's no self in all conversations, and they're dismissing real ethical or emotional concerns. And so if they've frozen their growth at this one insight, instead of letting new layers and complexities and different isms and different perspectives unfold over time. And then that reality, that spiritual reality, is now your new filter and bias. And then you start wrapping your identity around it, and boom, you're basically in a religion. You have an identity wrapped around certain things that you believe to be true, and your growth really stops. So this is probably where you're like, hey, Britt, isn't this you? Like, yes and no. At my best, I'm really open to whatever reality might be. There's lots of options: panpsychism, materialism, collective consciousness, deism. There's lots of options on the table. At my best, when I'm in a good headspace, it's like not knowing how many blades of grass exist in the world right now. Maybe that ultimate truth exists. Maybe that number actually exists, but we are not anywhere near being able to calculate that. And so what I'm trying to do is say, I don't know how many blades of grass there are, but I don't think it's two. Two would be like, Mormonism, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Scientologists, religions that are fairly easy to deconstruct in their truth claims. Like, I don't know what reality is, but I'm skeptical that it's two. Do you know what I mean? And that's not being closed-minded, because it's not the same as making truth claims. I don't know, nor claim to know, what ultimate reality is. I don't even know if we're interacting with it. So what I'm trying to do is say, I don't think it's two, but then what that's doing is not making me closed-minded. It's making me open to whatever reality is. So at my best, that's what I'm doing. And I realize that I'm not always operating with that level of openness where my biases aren't filtering information and I'm truly able to keep every option on the table. Am I always doing that? No. Like, I have my own wounds from religion. I have my own biases. So I'm not floating above these. These are pitfalls that I have to watch out for too. And I have my own teachers from different religious traditions that call out my biases and blind spots that I'm not seeing. When I asked ChatGPT what a common spiritual journey with these pitfalls looks like what a caricature of this looks like in a person, it sounds like a lot of people that I see on spirituality TikTok. So this is the caricature that ChatGPT gave for this. So there's a girl named Mia. Mia got into New Age spirituality. She dove headfirst into crystals, manifestation, astrology, energy healing, and endless YouTube videos about high vibes. At first, just learning the terms made her feel wise. Now she could talk about chakras and frequencies and 5D consciousness without ever having really experienced shifts inside herself. So she's mistaking knowledge for wisdom. And then whenever life got messy, breakups, job losses, loneliness, she quickly told herself it was all divine timing, or it was just the universe testing her vibration, or there's like a planetary explanation for this, rather than facing her grief and patterns honestly, which would be the spiritual bypassing part. As her bookshelf and crystal collection grew, so did her subtle sense of superiority. She started to see her friends who weren't spiritual as asleep or low vibe, even though she herself was still insecure and reactive and anxious. After her first intense meditation retreat, she declared herself awake because she felt blissed out for a few days. She quit her job, booked a one-way ticket to Bali, and started offering shadow work coaching to others, even though she still hadn't worked through most of her own wounds. For a while, Mia tried to kill off any hint of ambition, sadness, anger, or fear inside her, thinking that these emotions were not spiritual and to be eliminated to stay high vibe. When she struggled, she blamed herself for not manifesting correctly or assumed it was because she hadn't aligned her frequency enough, causing cycles of shame masked as spiritual striving. So over time, she noticed she was becoming more attached, not in a wise, open-hearted way, but in a numbed out, emotionally disconnected way. And it wasn't until a total breakdown, when the dream life she was curating fell apart, that Mia began a deeper, quieter form of spiritual work. She learned that true growth wasn't about floating above life or winning at being spiritual. It was about becoming more honest, more embodied, more tender, more awake, and a little less certain each day. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't Instagrammable, but it was hard and it was real. So each of these pitfalls reflects a kind of overconfidence combined with a lack of full integration. And this is really what the Dunning-Kruger effect will predict, even in this kind of enlightenment journey. So early glimpses of insight feel huge, but true enlightenment is humble and fluid and deeply human. And so I want to end here with, in my experience as a spiritual director, what does ego work look like in this awakening journey and how that differs between men and women, not necessarily because of biology. As far as how much we're nature and how much we're nurture, I'm not an expert in that space, and so I will leave experts to discuss that. But by whatever combination of biology and or programming from living in a patriarchal society or religion, or often both, how does this look like on average for men and women? So how ego work gets into this is, ego work isn't about killing your ego and becoming nobody. That's not the goal. The ego is simply your psychological structure, and it's the story you have about yourself that helps you to survive and connect and act in the world. So the goal isn't destruction, it's integration. Knowing knowing where the ego serves you and where it sabotages you. So here's the critical piece. Men and women generally are conditioned to build very different kinds of egos, which is why often their spiritual paths can look different because their ego work looks different. And I don't know to what extent this is nature or nurture, but and also, queer people, neurodivergent people, individual people will of course be all over the map on this, but we can talk generally in society what this looks like for men and women. So for many men in a patriarchal society, the ego tends to be overinflated. So it builds itself around achievement and dominance and performance and emotional toughness. Men are taught that to be vulnerable is to be weak, and self-worth is tied to how much they can conquer or produce, and then asking for help signals failure. And so as a result, ego work for men usually involves softening, learning how to feel emotions without shame, how to admit failure or uncertainty without crumbling, how to see others not as threats and competitors, but as allies. It's not about shrinking themselves. It's about dismantling the false belief that their worth depends on winning and controlling and outperforming. And true strength comes from also being able to be tender or humble or authentic. And so women, on the other hand, are more conditioned to shrink their ego rather than inflate it. So the cultural story for many women, especially if you're in patriarchal religion, it revolves around pleasing others. From a young age, we're told to smile. We're told to make sure to keep the men around us happy. We minimize our needs. That makes us good. That makes us a good person. That makes us a holy person. And tying our worth to relationships and likability. And so they're often taught consciously and unconsciously that to be assertive or ambitious or self-focused is selfish and bad. And so as a result, ego work for women often involves strengthening their ego, owning their power without guilt, expressing anger, and expressing desire unapologetically, allowing themselves to be disliked or misunderstood without collapsing. The task is to dismantle the belief that goodness equals self-erasure. And so true wholeness for women usually looks like stepping into a space where they were taught not to occupy, where they get bigger and they claim their voice and they become ambitious and they have boundaries and they have boldness without apology. That tends to be signs of spiritual growth for women in a patriarchal culture. But men often heal the ego by becoming softer and more emotionally open, and realizing that they're not the center of the universe. This is why there's this, cute quote on TikTok that goes viral every few months that men do psychedelics in order to feel what women feel in the bathroom in 8th grade, that you affect other people, that other people have their own lives, that other people have their own ways of seeing the world. And so men tend to struggle with ego inflation and need to work in reconnecting to humility and interconnection. And women tend to struggle with ego shrinking and often need to reconnect to courage. In both cases, ego work isn't about ego death or about erasing yourself. It's about seeing through these false survival stories or these false narratives. So the goal of ego work, the point of me talking about this at all, is that a healthy ego acts like clothing. And so the clothing is, I'm a Brittany, this is my name, these are my preferences, these are my qualifications, and I put that on like clothing in order to interact in the world. Clothing, it just makes it easier to interact in the world. But at any time, I can change my clothing, I can take off my clothing because I am not my clothing. My clothing is just this helpful outer layer that helps me to kind of interact in society. It's kind of a shortcut. And so at any time, I can just say, like, I don't want to wear this anymore. I don't like this anymore. I'm going to try this coat on over here, or I'm skinny dipping and I'm going to take my clothes off entirely and I feel completely comfortable. That's what we want an ego to feel like. And so what a healthy ego feels like for me is I can walk into the room, I can feel like I deserve to be there. And also when I'm totally wrong, or I learn something new, or someone calls me out on my bullshit, I can quickly say, you're right, I was wrong, my bad. That's a good point. I didn't consider that. And so it's both. It's being able to be in the room without shame or fear because I'm confident in myself and I have a good sense of self, but also that my clothing, my ego is so flexible and it's not fixed and I'm not clinging to it and it's not a facade, that I can change and I can make mistakes and I can learn and I can grow. And so when I'm in a good headspace, that's what a healthy ego looks like for me. And I can appreciate that my ego is just there to protect me. It just wants me to look good. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just part of me. But if I let it take over, it's going to start caring about my facade, and then it's going to start limiting me. So from someone who is not enlightened past tense, but just somewhere on this path, who spends a lot of time with people in the spiritual space, who's fallen into many of these traps myself, I just hope that there was something helpful here. That a good guide for me now is, am I getting better at sitting with my family? Am I getting better at sitting with discomfort? Am I getting better with saying I don't know? Am I getting better at sitting with death? Am I getting deeper into life, deeper into relationships, deeper into self-awareness? Do I know myself better now than I did a year ago? And if the answer is no to any of those questions, I'm usually escaping in some way, and then I can catch myself and get back to the real work. And the reason we even talk about the ego when we're talking about enlightenment is that even if these experiences are genderless, in the sense like when you get to a space where you're just sitting in consciousness and you are noticing objects in consciousness, we can perhaps call that a genderless space, where it seems like every human is able to access that experience. But how we get there definitely depends on our ego. It depends on our story. So if you're a woman and you're only focused on limiting yourself and getting smaller, that's going to limit your ability to be able to go to these places and experience these experiences. Same thing if you're a man. If you have an overinflated sense of ego, then it can also really limit your ability to change and grow and cut through the illusions and biases that help you to experience these places of inner transformation and inner transcendence even. The real work is just really not on Instagram. It's not on retreat. It's not in psychedelic work. It's recognizing that you hurt someone else, recognizing you were wrong, recognizing you're not the center of the universe, but you're not nothing either. And just letting go of clinging to forcing things to be different than they seem to be, or forcing things to be true that you want to be true emotionally. So Jack Kornfield, he's a Buddhist teacher that I genuinely like. He says, after the ecstasy, the laundry, meaning after a major insight, real life, conflicts, chores, messiness, grief still demands your care and attention. Or there's the older quote that precedes him, which is, before enlightenment, carry water. After enlightenment, carry water. So I hope that helps your awakening path. It's not about escaping the world. It's not about going up into the mountain in order to study love by yourself, which I always thought was a strange idea anyway. And it's not about ego work looking the same for everyone. There's many male gurus who talk a lot about ego dissolution, which can be helpful for men. And he can sometimes not realize that that same path is maybe not as helpful for women or queer people, or vice versa. It's very individual. So I just hope that there's something in there that helps you on your path of awakening and breaking through illusions, and just helping you suffer less in your brain, which is really what this is about, and less about escaping into truth claims that we just don't know are true yet, or feeling like you're separate from people, or escaping the hard emotional work because you want to, go on different planes where you're better than people. That's what we want to stay away from, because eventually, if reality hits our delusion, that's when we will hit a rock bottom, because all that spiritual work that we did that was kind of a facade will eventually hit reality at some point. And that's what we're trying to avoid. We want our spirituality to actually help us be able to withstand what it is to be a human and all the mess of what it is to be a human, rather than set us up to fail later on, which is what so much of certainly New Age spirituality does, but religion too. So hopefully there was something in there that was helpful for you, and I will see you next week. In the comments, I have a few ideas for what I want to do next week, but I'm always open to what you guys are waiting to hear or wanting to hear. I know that it was really helpful to get feedback for you guys wanted to hear about how to raise kids, and there was a lot of people who found that really helpful. So if there's something like that, if there's an ism you want me to dive into, or some part of your existential crisis or nihilism journey or awakening journey that you want just some words to be added to, because that would be helpful for you, just let me know in the comments, and I will see you guys next week.